Changes are happening in Flushing. They start in the dugout. The Mets, they announced a full-on coaching staff overhaul after missing the postseason. And it's clear that David Stearns, Carlos Mendoza, they are not messing around right now. Bench coach John Gibbons, he retired. Multiple assistants, including pitching coach Jeremy Hefner, they are out. And now the organization is searching for a new identity on the field and also in the clubhouse. So what does this shakeup really mean for the franchise moving forward? Well, joining me now on this bonus episode of Straight Outta Flushing for our dugout discussions and to break it all down is the great Mets content creator. You know him, Tyler Ward joins me now. Wardy, what's going on, man?
Dexter, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing good, man. I'm doing good. You know, we were just talking about it, trying to enjoy a little bit of the off season before the news cycle starts to build back up around the Mets. But, you know, we're always plugged in as we have to be. And so a lot of things I want to talk to you about because, Tyler, the Mets, they announced a massive shakeup to their coaching staff on Friday. When you saw that and all the names that were, you know, not coming back here, what was your initial reaction when you saw how extensive the overhaul was with the Mets coaching staff?
If I'm being completely transparent, I was relieved. This was something that I certainly expected, but to see it come to fruition was a different story. Some of the people that the Mets parted with out of this coaching staff were something that fans, including myself, were longing for throughout the course of the season. So to see that finally come to fruition, you know, again, caused that relief, as well as being surprised to a degree with some of the moves that they made, in particular when evaluating the status of pitching coach now moving forward. Dexter, throw it back to you. What was your initial reaction? Were you expecting the Mets to basically clean house for the most part outside of Antoine Richardson and Mendoza here, or did this really take you by surprise?
So I was surprised about some of the moves here, right? Yes, Antoine Richardson, I was like, there's no way he's going to go with all the success that he had in terms of base stealing with the Mets, particularly even Juan Soto. No way he was going. Jeremy Hefner surprised me a little bit. The hitting coaches, no surprise there at all for me whatsoever. Here's my thing, Wardy, and then we can further discuss this more. When this stuff happens after a season like we saw from the Mets, it's always a situation, I think, around fans, media, content creators, whoever you want to call in this conversation. Who is to blame here, right? Where does the blame fall? And right, I talked a lot on this show about players have agency. This is on the players. The players did not execute here. But you and I have covered sports long enough that we know somebody's got to take the blame. I was very quick. I was about to tweet out something about this and how the Mets were sort of just, trying to take the pressure off the players. But then I was talking to fellow content creator Anthony Rivera of the Subway to Shea podcast. He texted me and he said something I thought was pretty interesting. I do know a lot of Mets fans were calling for this, including yourself, including sweeping changes to the coaching staff. But he also made the point that, look, David Stearns, Carlos Mendoza haven't had their guys in here with them. They haven't had their guys, and this is a time for them to finally do this. And I thought about that and I said, that makes a lot of sense when you think about it in terms of that. If you want to fairly evaluate a front office and a coaching staff, well, they want to have everybody else on the same page. So in some ways, what a long way of saying is I think eventually this was necessary, and I think they had to do this. So when you look at all this, Wardy, and the moves that were made here, I think the big question you have is, from some fans is, does it matter what the pitching coach does? Does it matter what the hitting coach does? How much of what we saw from these coaches matter to the result that we saw in 2025?
Oh, it matters for a multitude of reasons, and that goes in direct hand as to why there need to be change. And while I think you and I can both agree there was a surprising move there, and Jeremy Hefner being parted with as someone who's been a part of this organization pretty much Steve Cohen's entire tenure and has been deemed by many in the organization and by rival scouts as someone who knows exactly what they're doing. But when you look at other aspects of this coaching staff, this was something that was most certainly expected. So yes, does this matter? It for sure does. You look at the numbers, for example, on the Mets offense this past season, they were basically top 5 in every statistical category. But if you looked at it just in that lens without understanding the context of the season, you would say to yourself, how dare the Mets part ways with guys in Eric Chavez and Jeremy Barnes? But when you understand the context of a team that drastically underperformed all the way until August as a bomb 5 team in baseball with runners in scoring position, finally prevailed and did the complete opposite of that from August on in the year, and that was great. But it was pretty too little too late for the offense at that point of the year, along with the other woes that the Mets had on the pitching end. Then you hear from even Eric Chavez himself there, Will Salmon of The Athletic, among others, how the Mets should not have co-hitting coaches, how it really didn't cause much good, but rather a problem for them when looking at the numbers versus someone needing to be the voice. It didn't click the way that it needed to. And that's why the Mets can move forward now, learn from these mistakes, and know that the next people that they bring in for these respective positions, maybe they won't go with the two hitting coaches. And the person that they may bring in could be a perfect blend of a Barnes and a Chavez. Someone who is, say, not far removed from the game, understands today's games well, but also knows how to view the analytics, the advanced metrics, along with that in-game feel. Something that I think we can all agree the Mets were severely lacking throughout the entire course of the season this past year. So, in a long way of summarizing what I have to say, it doesn't matter, coaches, absolutely, but the variance really dictates based on what the team is doing around, including the pitching lab, for example. You can have great pitching coaches on paper, but if they don't have the right information or the processes around to really get the best out of themselves and the performance of the players, then you shouldn't be overly surprised that maybe you're having lack of success in that respective area.
I love a lot of what you said there, including when it came to looking at the hitting awardee, right? You have to look at the totality of everything. You can't just say, okay, they were top 5 in all these categories. We know you're somebody who does content on this team on a daily basis. The issue was runners in scoring position. There's no doubt about that. You can look at further issues with the pitching, and you can also say, okay, did this rotation have enough stability to withstand the rigors of a long season? We saw that they failed in many aspects. They did not have a top-end starter at the top of this rotation. That also hurt them. So, yeah, I do think it matters. We are going to see how much more it matters for this team going on into the future. But I think when you look at this move, right, Wardy, do you think this was a message move from David Stearns and Carlos Mendoza to reset the culture? Or is this one that was like purely about baseball decisions, purely a baseball decision, I should say, about results with this team? Like, hey, the results did not happen. This is not what we wanted in 2025. This is why we had to make these moves.
I think it was a perfect excuse for David Stearns to go back to, as you mentioned, and as I've been relaying for a while, which is cutting ties with bait who have been grandfathered in from, say, Billy Epler and the previous regimes of front offices for the New York Mets. That's something that I think makes, a multitude of reasons as to why that happened when you look at guys again like Chavez, like Barnes, like Hefner, and even, like other aspects of what they parted with. It makes sense now in a year where everything went wrong for the Mets, for now David Stearns, for the first time as team president, I think we can all rightfully agree, now has a level of pressure on his back by Steve Cohen to go out and perform after everything going wrong, after spending the big bucks on Juan Soto. So now that he has that slight pressure on his back to a varying degree, it's important for him to make sure that not only does he have control over everything regarding this team, but that he really is in clear dictation of who is here and why. He did not have that to the full magnitude, as we alluded to a little bit earlier. So now he will get that opportunity. Carlos Mendoza now is going into this in a very different mindset, I'm sure, as he will have pressure on himself to a degree. And this is a perfect split of not only holding accountable people who probably have been here a little bit too long, we could probably say, along with the fact that this is a results-oriented business. If you're not going to even make playoffs after having arguably the largest payroll in baseball and the largest contract in North American sports history, it's not going to be a good look not only for the media, but it's not going to be a great look for the fans that spend the hundreds of dollars to show up at a record-breaking fashion the way that they did at Citi Field this
No,
season.
I'm glad you actually said that, right? Because that's such a huge part of this. It's everybody's going to say, okay, the $340 million payroll, but it's really about the fans. And Steve Cohen asked for the fans to come out to the ballpark this year. The fans did do that. And you can't be mad. And if anybody's saying, oh, well, it's just a down year for the Mets. No, the fans have every right to be disappointed. The fans have every right to have had the expectations that they did coming into this year. And then the Mets did not live up to any of them, at least be a playoff team. And they did not make the playoffs despite those high expectations. Now, you just hit on Carlos Mendoza. And after the season, Ward, he said, as a whole, we failed, talking about the whole organization. What does that tell you about how he's viewing his own role in this, in terms of, when I say this, I mean in terms of what happened in 2025, and then his job security heading into 2026? It sounds to me like some self-awareness there, but how do you view how he's viewing everything here?
Yeah, I think we're going to see a greater level of accountability being held moving forward. There has to be, right? There's definitely instances where the Mets may have been a bit too conservative, not as proactive as even David Stern stated himself there in his closing remarks on the season with the media, how he himself can do a better job moving forward on being proactive. But for Mendoza, this is absolutely in hand because he now, similar to David Stearns, has pressure on him because what is the next domino to fall? And this David Stearns ran regime should next season not perform well, say halfway through. If any drastic moves are going to happen, it's going to be the skipper and Carlos Mendoza. As simple as that. David Stearns needs to make sure that he's saving face while also making sure that he doesn't have a leash too long for someone who clearly was behind the eight ball more times than not, it felt, with in-game decisions throughout the course of the season for the Mets. Very frustrating, very unfortunate because you and I can both agree, Dexter, when you throw out 46, 47 pitchers the most in any team's history in a singular season, because you don't have any stability at all from your rotation, your bullpen, that's not on Carlos Mendoza. The same way it's not on Mendy, how you have everybody and their mother get her in the rotation or get her come back but not perform like anything else but batting practice. It's a massive problem. So, yeah, for Carlos Mendoza, it's about accountability while also being self-aware, as you stated yourself, that now time's ticking and he needs to make sure that he goes out and performs in a win now market. Now, back to you, Dexter. Do you feel same in that regard, or do you have different, varying opinions?
No. I completely feel the same in that it's going to be pressure on Carlos Mendoza. Now, I'm not saying the seat is hot. It's not what I'm saying. But it will get warm if he has a slow start. I agree with you 100% that Carlos Mendoza was behind the eight ball with the hand that he was all the time, particularly with the pitching rotation. All the pitchers we saw come up and go down, right? The pitchers not being able to stay healthy. There's only so much a manager can do. This brings me back to my point. Players have to execute. They did not. Also, managers and players have to be set up, I don't care what you do for work, to succeed. And some of that to me falls a little bit on David Stearns, right? Whether you agree with his philosophy in mind or how he's going to build a baseball team and all that, that's cool. But Carlos Mendoza, I could make an argument, wasn't necessarily put in the best situation to always succeed this year. Now, here's the thing, Wardy. That all sounds crazy when the payroll is $340 million, right? Nobody's trying to hear that when the payroll is $340 million and they're paying the ticket prices they are to go to these games. And this is where I want to be respectful to the fans and all that. That's the hard thing for fans to hear. Nobody wants to hear that. They want results. And as you said, it's a results-based business. And I think that's fair. I do think there was some self-awareness by Carlos Mendoza in his comments, and I think that's something, if you're a fan of a team or this team in particular, you want to hear from your manager. I think he will understand exactly what next year is about. I think David Stearns will understand what next year is about, but they got to get to work. We could talk about this all through the offseason, but you got to see the results. Now, you talked about David Stearns. You're right. If something goes slow with this team, if they don't get off to a good start next year, you're 100% right. Carlos Mendoza is who everyone will be talking about. Us in the media will be talking about, okay, is he the right guy for this? That's going to be the next domino to fall, as you said. But they've made these changes, and which coaching changes surprised you the most that they made? Were there any names that you thought actually deserved to stay that didn't stay?
I would say if there was anyone that deserved to stay, that was parted with, where the Mets made the decision to part ways with them, I would say that's Jeremy Hefner. He had a 2026 team option on his contract, and the Mets politely declined. And it's kind of crazy to think about, just knowing how much he has been highly coveted in the organization the past north of 5 years now. A former Mets pitcher, mind you, not long removed at all from the game as an active pitcher. Really strong mind in helping structure and formulate what has been going on in this Mets pitching lab by building the great relationships with one Eric Yeagers, who is the VP of pitching for this Mets team, and he's been brilliant in his own right. Hefner, to lose him is certainly going to sting because he feels like one of those guys that's inevitably going to land with another contending team or a team on the rise, and don't be surprised when he finds himself having success. But I think, like anything else, sometimes things get stale after a while. And whether you have a great voice initially, things may change as the year goes on. Things may change as you get into year 4, year 5. And the Mets, David Stearns, while he appreciates Hefner and has appreciated his value, there was too much that went wrong this year pitching-wise that whether he views him as, all right, I need to use you as the excuse to a degree, or just pairing that with, yes, we had a lot of things go wrong pitching health-wise this year, but for the guys that were healthy, you did not do a great job on helping them down this stretch. Whatever the case may be, that led to the departure of Hefner wanting a new voice and a change there. So I wish him success. I'm sure he will have that elsewhere. But now what the Mets need to do is to make sure that they fill that void with a mind that not only is able to blend well with the lab that they have, because people joke about the lab and say it's invaluable and stuff like that. It doesn't have much meaning. It most certainly does. If you exclude the injuries for the Mets this year, there was a lot that was still going right for them on the pitching end, including guys like Griffin Canning, who you can credit in part Jeremy Hefner to helping get himself right. Sean Manaea last year with the arm slot change. The list goes on and on. So Hefner, my personal biggest criticism with him was his lack of proper feel in game. It felt like many times, more so in years past than necessarily this season, but we've seen it at times like any other pitching coaches coming out a little too long, after clearly the guy who's already rocked, basically done for in the start, or bring him a little too early. It's like, what are we doing here? It just, in similarity to Carlos Mendoza, where he felt like that he was missing the mark a lot with his in-game decision making. That too held true in my fan point of view at times of Hefner in the past, and that's me really grasping at straws to say that Hefner will be sorely missed, and the Mets are going to need to do everything in their power to make sure that they replace him with someone similarly minded, but also a David Stearns true hire that can hopefully get the best out of this Mets pitching staff moving
Yeah,
forward.
no, that's a good point because when that happens, you got to make sure you get a guy that can. You talk about replacing anybody, whether it's players, coaches. You got to make sure you get somebody in that can also do the job. I think Hefner did a good job, Wardy. I do think some of the in-game stuff is fair. I think sometimes not using mound visits in the way Mets fans would want to see, not coming out at all when you saw things potentially falling apart. That's a fair critique, I think, of him. But I do think overall he did a good job, and that's why I was a little bit shocked. You
Agreed.
mentioned some of the highlights he had, whether it was with Luis Severino last year, Sean Manaea. I mean, I think he should get credit for Clay Holmes this year and what he was able to do. So, yeah, there were some good things that you saw there. But as the Mets rebuild their staff, we talked about John Gibbons. He retired as bench coach. And some people look at bench coaches, very important. That's the right-hand man of the manager, right? What qualities do you think they need most in a bench coach to complement Carlos Mendoza in 2026?
Now, this is a great question because I am very split down the middle as to what I think would work best. Because you have the one way of thinking, which is someone of similar ilk to someone like John Gibbons, and that is a veteran, potential former manager, someone who very vocal, has been around the game, has seen a lot of winning, has won championships themselves. That person, in my opinion, that would check off more boxes than one. And be an extrovert the way that Mendoza comes off at times as an introvert with his lack of true voice that we at least see publicly with his displeasure with the team, really being a straight shooter and saying it how it is. Instead, he kind of finds himself giving you a little bit of a word salad that you're not looking for. Ron Washington fits that mold perfectly. And if there is at all a mutual interest between Ron and the Mets, and you could somehow prime away from maybe going to Atlanta, where Gibbons retired as Mets bench coach, yes, but he might get a managerial opportunity in Atlanta for all we know. There are some ties there. So you really do have to wonder what the future of Ron is now that Artie Moreno said no thank you and wants Pujols instead for the Angels. See how that goes. But Ron Washington would be a great veteran fit. And if it's not going to be someone like him, then I think the contrasting pick would be someone that isn't at all far removed from today's game, understands today's game very well, and also understands how this Mets team is ran very well. And if you're going to get someone that doesn't have the coaching experience but has all the accolades in the world from a player point of view, look no further than for 5 minutes Mets manager 6 years ago, Carlos Beltran, who's currently in the Mets front office. I mean, not only does he have a great rapport with the players as is, but he understands today's metrics. He understands today's analytics. He understands how to balance those numbers from the in-game feel in a way where we can all agree Carlos Mendoza just constantly missed the mark on. And you might say to yourself, oh, Beltran, it comes off fairly similar to Mendoza in the way that maybe they would approach the game. Yeah, I think that they would have some things that they would be similarly minded, but I don't think that's a bad thing either because Mendoza can't relate as someone who didn't play to the degree that Beltran did. Yes, Mendy was a former player and he knows what it's like to be a pro and all those things. But Beltran reached highs that very few have done at the major league level. And he's hit those highs to a degree and lows in a Mets uniform. Has been in the front office as the assistant, the GM the past couple of years, listen, if Carlos has any appetite to be in a coaching staff again, I think it would be silly for the Mets not to, at minimum, consider him because I think there's a lot of upside there to potentially be the passing of the torch. Because if things don't go right for Mendy, then you think the Mets are going to hesitate too long to then have someone like Beltran come in? The way that, fittingly, Beltran had his scandal with the Astros, as we know. But something that I heavily admired about that Astros team was not even their players, but their coaching staff. That was Alex Cora and how great he did as bench coach for that Beltran team, Ray J. Hinch. I see similarities from Cora to Beltran and the way that he would impact the game. But you got to start as a bench coach ultimately before you get yourself to manager.
So as you were saying that, and as you were making the description of the type of bench coach you would, after you talked about Ron Washington, who I also agree, I think would be somebody good in that mold of a bench coach for the Mets. And you brought up, I was like, okay, Wardy's going to Beltran. I saw where you were going there. Here's somewhat of a little bit of a pushback on Beltran, who I want to be very clear about what I'm going to say. I do think he'd be good for a team. I do think he could have a good impact on a team. If they go with Beltran, let's say they go with Beltran for the bench coach, Wardy, do you think that puts more pressure on Mendoza, where his seat gets a little bit hotter because Beltran is right there next to him on the bench? So let's say they get off to a slow start and they're 10-15 in their first 25 games. You know what time it's going to be. I don't have to tell you this. You know exactly what's going to happen. Fans are going to start saying, well, we got the guy right there. He's right here on the bench. Let's put Beltran in. So I'm wondering, is that really good for the team? I'm curious as to what you think. Is that good for the team if the players, if the whole organization knows Beltran will be right there behind Mendoza? Is that really fairly giving Mendoza the best shot to manage his team in 2026?
That is a fair counter, but I think like anything else with this Mets fandom, they're always going to find something to yap about. So if it ain't going to be Carlos Beltran, it will be Ron Washington, or it will be whoever they have in that bench role. So I don't know exactly how much Carlos being that man is the differentiator and fans still reacting in that same way. Should they start 10-15 or 10-20, whatever the case may be. It's a fair one because we know that fan pressure is a real thing. We see players in real time crumble in these big markets, i.e. Joey Gallo, for example. And it's really unfortunate when you see that for guys who are also New York native, who grew up idolizing these teams, and it just didn't work out. I think for Mendoza, he just needs someone to pair with him that can be that voice where maybe he's been lacking. And not that Mendy can't get feisty. I know he can. I've seen him pissed off before. It's not a good look. You don't want to be a part of it like anything else. You feel like that you're the kid that's getting yelled at in class. It's not an enjoyable feeling. But if you have someone that can pair with him that is not only similarly minded, but also can be able to bounce off their experiences in a way that he just simply can't get to the same level of, including Ron, including Beltran, as well as there's so many other people that can be considered. I mean, I don't even think it would be a bad idea to consider Andy Green, even though he's doing so good in Mets player development right now. He was the bench coach for the Cubs just a couple years ago there for David Ross. So that's another name that I think would make plenty sense for this team if they want to stay more internal versus external. Now, Dexter, back to you, just to stay on the bench topic for a second. One talking about internal options, here's another that I personally am a big fan of as well. And I mentioned him in a recent video of mine because when you look at the coaching candidates for the Mets, they're very widespread in what they can be, from full experience veterans like Ron to people who have little to no experience like Beltran. But there's someone who's kind of been in the middle of recent that did a great job with Francisco Alvarez as a former Major League Baseball catcher. And that's Syracuse Mets bench coach and JP Arencibia. He glowingly got Alvarez right, and he seems to have really had a good rapport with a lot of other people developing into Syracuse to ultimately get the Major League level. So are you more for an internal hire for this Mets team or an external hire, and why?
I actually am probably more in the market for, I'd be looking for an internal hire. And
Okay.
JPR Senior has been mentioned too. Our Mike Puma has mentioned him as a possible candidate the Mets could definitely be looking at to move up into one of these positions. The reason I say why is because, and my why depends on an if, and I'll say this. If the Mets are trying to continue to do what they said they were going to do, which is they have this desire to be the Dodgers East, right? And that is they want to spend on high-end talent when they can that are in the prime years of their playing careers, particularly when it comes to pitching. And they also want to develop young players that they can bring up and hopefully contribute at the major league level, or then use those assets for trades, right? Which is a philosophy I generally would agree with, to be pretty efficient in baseball. If you want to do that, then I think you need to know guys who have spoken to these young players as they come up through the system, understand what it's like to see these young players come through the system, and then maybe also be able to tell them how it is to be at the major league level. And I think it's a real reason when you mentioned JP and his work with Francisco Alvarez. We saw Alvarez go down this year. We saw how he handled that demotion. And I think a lot of credit needs to be given to Francisco for his attitude and focus in doing that. But also, it takes a village, right? It takes the people around you to have that energy and uplift you through the good times and the bad times and push you to where you need to go. And I think that's a very good quality, and JP was very much a part of that. So I think that could bode well for the Mets. But I'm going to kind of play devil's advocate for myself. Sometimes you don't want too many people internally, that are all doing everything similarly. You want people to be on the same page to get to that common goal, which is to win a World Series. So sometimes you need to hear some stuff from the outside. Sometimes you need to hear from some people who've maybe done things a little bit differently. Diversity is always good. It's good for any business. So I think that can be good as well. I think it depends on what position we're talking about. I think for a bench coach, I might actually go say external. But maybe for like pitching and some other development stuff, I might go internal. I think a bench coach external, because I kind of agree with what you're saying. Mendoza, I think, would be better with somebody maybe very different tone from him. And that could be older or younger. I don't think that necessarily matters. I just think in terms of the tone in his delivery, somebody else who can talk to players in the clubhouse, maybe approach it in a different way. So yeah, it depends on the position. I think for bench coach, I lean more to external, or somebody that's just either from a different era. Because I guess Beltran is technically internal, but somebody from a different era. That's kind of where I go on that. But I like that. Yeah. I like that question from you. Let me ask you this. Let me also ask you this. Because for the hitting coach position, and I always find when you talk about hitting coaches, it's so interesting to me, Wardy, because sometimes during the season, I know you've heard this, like fire the hitting coach. I don't think that does anything really in a season, but I think outside of the season, like the Mets have done here, that can work. I did not personally like having two hitting coaches, right? And I thought the comments we saw from Eric Chavez to Will Salmon in his athletic piece that he had, which was really good, and spoke about that. It was very interesting, the comments that we heard from Eric Chavez about how he thought there should be a singular voice as the hitting coach. So let's say they go with a singular voice. What kind of profile of a hitting coach should they target? Should it be, because there's a great debate on this, Wardy, as you know, someone more analytics driven, or should it be a former player who connects more on feel and approach? And this is where I'm going to bring up a candidate you mentioned before for another role, but could Carlos Beltran be somebody that would work as a hitting coach?
I think Beltran would work marvelously as that role. But the problem is, I don't know if he wants that. When you bear in mind, he's currently the assistant, like, to the GM. He's like kind of the Dwight Schrute, if you will, to the Michael Scott here. And does he want to move? Is that going to be a lateral move in his eyes? Is that going to be a move up for him? I don't know what his priority is right now when it comes to him staying in the organization currently to stay in the front office, or has this always been a goal of his to get back to the opportunity to eventually be this team's manager? If that is still at all a goal or something that he's wanting for, then yes, I think hitting coach would make a lot of sense. I also think a guy who's been playing pickleball brilliantly this past year and having fun doing little TikToks with his wifey, that being a JD Martinez, could do more than enough wonders for this team in a hitting coach role if he himself had interest, because he is not even like officially retired, is a hitting savant, knows this Mets team, understands Steve Cohen, and brought more, I think we can all agree, in his voice and his leadership and his experience than he did with his on-field product for the Mets in 2024, was the voice of reason in the Carlos Mendoza and David Stearns' ear as to why they called up Jose Iglesias when they did. Otherwise, they weren't going to do so at any point that early into the year. I think JD Martinez makes a lot of sense if you're going to get someone who's so close to being removed from today's game, because I think there's such an important attribute to such a thing. I also think there's a very important attribute to those who have continued great track records of success. And there's someone who has their contract up at the end of this season, currently for the Philadelphia Phillies, and it's Mr. Kevin Long. Kevin Long, whether you love him or hate him, I'll be completely blunt. I know people, former players in the industry, that loved Kevin Long and others that absolutely hated him, like no in between, just from their own personal experiences. And it was really fascinating to hear these different traits regarding him because of the difference in approach that those players had. I'm curious how much about his own mentality has changed and adjusted to today's game because Long had a plethora of success during his time with the Yankees from 2007 to 2014. And then he was with the Mets from 2015 to 2017, helped them go from an offense on paper before Cespedes had literally nothing for the most part. And he made them around top 10 in baseball somehow that year. And then you got on to the 2016 run that unfortunately fell short in the wild card. And then 2017, Mets didn't have pitching and so on and so forth from there. Then he wins the World Series with the Washington Nationals over his 4-year span there. And who does he create a great relationship with and is very good buddies with, apparently? That is Mr. Juan Soto. And then that brings us to the Philadelphia Phillies. Kyle Schwarber, who I'm sure the Mets would love to heavily target this offseason. That could be a connection that stays true, as well as the fact that look at the great offense the Phillies have had. Batters box or not, they have been one of the top offenses in the National League that we have seen since he's arrived there each of the past 4 seasons or so. So if you want track record, Kevin Long is the guy you throw the bag at, and which he's probably going to take the biggest bag at this point in his career. That could reel him over back to Flushing, Queens for his second time around, or go with someone more of, I just stopped playing baseball. I know today's game perfectly, and I know how to speak to these players on a level that we're going to be equal without them feeling like that they're a less in any way, shape, or form.
I think all those possibilities are interesting, right? And so you got ahead of me a little bit here because I was going to ask you if you had to throw out a name or two, who do you think could be realistic fits and for a pitching coach? Because we did hitting here. So you mentioned some names. There's some really good names. I think Kevin Long would be I'm fine with bringing him back. I think that would be really good. Beltran, I do agree with you. Beltran, a good fit, but I wonder if he would view that as a lateral move. So let's just go with pitching coaches, because you haven't had some names there. In terms of pitching coaches and replacing Jeremy Hefner, what are some names you think could be realistic names there to replace Jeremy Hefner as pitching coach?
Here, let's give you an internal and an external option. Honorable mention goes to Desi Driscoll. I just don't know what the Mets want to do there with him right now because they've allowed him to speak to other teams as they continue their search for a pitching coach. So to be determined on Desi, but I hope he stays in the organization. He's had, nothing but positive reviews that I've seen over the past year from people in the organization. But when looking at internal options, let's take a look at no one further than AJ Sager, who is the current pitching coach for the Mets in AAA Syracuse. He has done a fantastic job with Brandon Sproat that we saw, especially in the second half. Noah McLean, to a degree, Jonathan, worked with these guys as well to a degree with the Rummel Ponies prior because he has not been with Syracuse more than a year and a half now, similar to JPR and Sebia. So Sager's done a very good job. If the Mets want to stay more in-house with a guy who knows exactly the direction this farm is going, knows how Steve Cohen is running ship, and completely understands how Eric Yeagers is going about this pitching lab, I think the Mets may have, an advantage there already, should they wish to stay in-house. If they want to go external, there are a lot of people that can check off the box. And I think you could take a look at least 5 to 10 teams in MLB right now that have an active assistant pitching coach or pitching coach that, if granted opportunity or at the end of their contract, would be of interest for the New York Mets. But there is a couple in particular that stand out, including a veteran, that being in Robin Lund. Robin Lund is currently the assistant pitching coach for the Detroit Tigers. But previously, before that, he was for north of a decade. They're doing a great job coaching for Iowa, which is where he built his relationship with Mets VP of pitching, that being in Eric Yeagers. So if the Mets do decide to prioritize kind of having those internal ties with someone who's had such heavy hands on what the Mets are doing with their lab, that being in Yeagers, then Lund falls in that category, as well as a plethora of other people out there. I can go on the checklist for sure, but those are just a couple that initially pop in my mind. Throwing it back to you, Dexter, what's your thoughts about that?
My thoughts on this is I think you're on the page that I am, which is however they do this, I think there will be some ties to Yeager in the pitching lab because you're going to want, I think specifically with how the Mets have talked about the pitching lab and how they've wanted to develop their pitchers, you're going to need somebody that's going to come in on the same page. So bringing in someone from the outside that maybe doesn't have necessarily those connections, and look, this is how the world works. This is how a lot of jobs are and opportunities are given, right? It is about those connections. It's about those relationships. And obviously, at the end of the day, it's about the results. So I think it's either going to be internal or somebody external that does have ties going back to the Mets. That would make a lot of sense for me. I think another name you could look at if you're going to look at externally, the name is fully escaped me, but is the Pirates pitching coach who's done a really good job with their staff this year. They had an ERA, I think it was just about 3.8 this year. And listen, he was doing the Lord's work there despite it being Pittsburgh, right? And the challenges that they have there. I think that can be somebody who can get a look into coming into an organization because you've seen somebody in another place doing it well with young pitchers, despite not maybe having a lot of talent offensively around them, still being able to produce a pretty good number. Staff ERA was really good there. I think that's someone you could look at as well too. But I do tend to agree with you. I think the ties will be more to Yeager in this pitching lab as they're going to want some continuity in that. But Wardy, when you look at this overall, this Mets coaching turnover, do you think it could impact how free agents view the organization this offseason? That, hey, if we want to come to the Mets and play in Flushing, this is a team that's had a lot of coaching turnover there. I see a free agent looking at it and saying they're figuring a lot out over there. Does that impact how free agents might view the Mets this offseason?
Depending on the player that you talk to, absolutely. There's some players around the league right now that still view the Mets as the LOL Mets, and I don't say that, happily. It's just a reality. When you have still your first 5 years under Steve Cohen and more losing than winning, these things are going to happen. But what's also true is what's been going around easily over the past 2.5 years, especially, has been how amazing the Mets have been with hospitality for players that they bring in, as well as taking care of their family. And that has not only been a differentiator to a degree in bringing in someone like Juan Soto, along with the $765+ million, of course, but it also holds true with a lot of other people that they brought in the past. I mean, Alex and Steve Cohen were on the phone, vouching for why Mark Hanna and his family should move to New York before he signed here. They did this with Scherzer's family. They did it with so many in the past. And I think having not only that personability, but the hospitality aspect to really do what's best to take care of these players is going to still hold true and shine bright for the Mets this offseason, knowing he has such a great rapport with Scott Boras, who is going to be repping all the top players for the most part, headlined by Pete Alonso especially. But yeah, no, that's currently how I feel in that regard. I'm curious your thoughts if they're similar or any different.
Yeah, I think it depends on the level of player, as you said. I think for players who are in that all-star status, upper echelon status, like a Juan Soto, I think people don't think sometimes, Wardy, that stuff matters as much as it does. And I'm here to tell you, it matters. It matters a ton, especially for those players. If you've been around the teams, and for those of us who've been a little bit, you could say, behind the scenes, right, covering these teams, the players who are stars. This goes for Major League Baseball. It goes for the NBA. This goes for the NFL. All this stuff. How the players are treated, how their wives are treated, how their families are treated when they come in on game day, how they're accommodated by the team. That stuff matters a lot because people, just like anything, you want to feel good when you go to work. You want to know if you bring people that you love to the workplace, they are treated well. So I think that matters more than the change that's going over. I think the reason I asked that question is, and you mentioned the LOL Mets. Sometimes people can look at a lot of change as a sign of instability.
For sure.
This will kind of lead to where I'm going next in the conversation. But what I will say is, I tend to look at it more as a sign of accountability, right? And good organizations, in my opinion, in any line of work, look at what's happening with their organization and say, okay, this is good or this is not. This is where we need to change. This is where we need to grow. Complacency, I do think continuity matters, just to be clear. Complacency is what you don't want. So if I was a player, and even if I was a role player, and I looked at the Mets and said, they had a $340 million payroll. We all know damn well that was a disappointment last year, right? They did not make the playoffs. But they looked at that and they weren't satisfied. That would actually make me say, I want to know more about what's going on over there. I want to know what they're doing. How are they holding everybody accountable? That's what I'd want to know more about. So it's funny. I think in a way it could benefit the Mets. I just think it depends on the player. It depends on their mindset and how they look at the game.
Yeah, the accountability aspect is important, especially when you look at who the Mets parted with, right? I think if you saw the Mets abruptly cut ties with Carlos Mendoza, that is not a good organizational look. And that is what I was relaying for the past north of 2 months now. Regardless of how bad of a year Mendoza's had on paper, doesn't change the fact that if you have four managers in a 6-year span under your new esteemed, high spending owner, how great of a look is that across the league? And the answer to that is it's not great. But what is great has been the Mets and Steve Cohen's continued willingness to spend big dollars on players that he believes is worthy to do so. And those big dollars being spent will always cut through more than anything else. And the Mets do moving in every single offseason. Doesn't matter the label they had them the year prior. Yes, some players will be like, you haven't had continued consistent success. I don't want to come here because you don't feel like you're going to put me in that direction. And that's fine, well, and good. I completely understand that. But there's a lot of players that have their best years and their walk years for the exact same reason, like others, and that is they want the biggest bag. And when it comes down to the biggest bag, Steve Cohen's going to learn not to spend like a drunken sailor, maybe to a degree that he has in the past, but he's always going to shell out the big bucks for players that he deserves, that he believes at least are going to be here, hopefully for the better.
Yeah, and that should matter to the fans because they've seen it not be the case for this franchise. They've seen where they've had ownership that will not spend at all whatsoever. And that's a good segue to bring to how we'll wrap here with the fans, because how do you think the fans should interpret these moves, Wardy? Should they look at it as what we're just talking about, a sign of accountability, a sign of change, or is it a warning that the organization is still trying to find its footing under Stearns and Mendoza? Because there are going to be some fans that look at it this way and say, there's still, I don't know about this franchise. They're still trying to find their way. How do you think they should look at it?
It's definitely both. You have to look at accountability because you can't have the season the Mets just had and think that there's no change. If the Mets ran it back with everybody from coaching staff to player personnel, fans would show up hopefully at least in half at Citi Field because they would be beyond fuming with a reality, which is that no changes were made. And you always need changes of significance when things get this bad. But it's not just accountability, it is, as you stated, adjusting to the David Stearns era. We have to remember the core group that you're seeing blossom in large part with the Milwaukee Brewers right now was helped built by the foundation heavily from David Stearns. David Stearns was in the Brewers organization for north of a decade, and it took that long to find continued sustained success while dealing with pennies on the dollar versus what he can do now, and that's to spend to a greater degree than anybody should he really wish to do so with the Mets. So it's about adjusting to the David Stearns timeline that yes, this season did not live up to expectations, but it suggests that the Mets are still not in great direction moving forward is kind of silly. When you look at the blossoming their farm, how tremendous they were in player development, the Mets have the best farm in baseball and their pitching staff that was deemed across MLB as well. So there are a lot of things on the future that look unbelievably bright that Stearns has had his hands on. He just needs to have more hands on deck as well as to learn from those mistakes, which was a lot of short-term acquisitions becoming absolutely nonsensical acquisitions for guys that either were down injury for the entire year or just did not at all perform to what we hoped for that we saw from this past season entering 2025.
So I guess that brings me to the last thing here, which I'm going to bring it back to you, Wardy, because when you take all of that of what you just said and you look at the shakeup here on the coaching staff and seeing that, does it make you more confident? And there's a long way to go. I just want to be clear, a long way to go before we get to the start of 2026 and free agency and all that stuff. But does it make you more confident with what you've seen, or are you more worried about the Mets heading into 2026?
No, that's a fair question. I don't know if I would say I'm worried heading into 2026. I would just say it's filled with uncertainty is where I'm at right now. And I'm filled with more uncertainty heading into an off season and a following season than I have in a couple of years now. In the sense that even after signing Juan Soto, you still managed to not make playoffs. Like it's still such a very difficult thing to try to wrap my head around, even when we saw every reasoning as to how we got to this point over north of a 4 month span. But really the viewpoint that I have right now. It's one of those things where it's filled with uncertainty, but do I still have a level of faith and trust in this organization and Steve Cohen and David Stearns? I do, because this is a direction that Steve's wanted since the Mets first got bought by him. And it's not his fault that it took him 2.5, 3 years to land the guy because he was still under contract with the previous organization. Have to bear that in mind. We would not be in the same circumstance right now if David Stearns was hired right from the get-go the way that Steve Cohen longed and initially intended to do.
Yeah, you're right. And listen, I think there's a lot you can be excited about with the Mets heading into 2026. You just mentioned all the stuff with the farm system. Now, fans, I get it. You still want to see what happens on the field at Citi Field in Flushing. That stuff matters in 2026, and you want to see the results. But I don't feel like the Mets are that far off. And, I think it's lazy sometimes for people to say LOL Mets and all that stuff. We will see how it goes. Wardy, you were the perfect person I wanted to discuss this with about the coaching changes because you're as plugged in as anybody. You're into the team. You're locked into the farm system, everything that's going on. I thought it'd be a good discussion. This was a good one because there's a lot of change with the Mets, and some people will look at that and some people will worry. But I think having a nuanced discussion about it and what could come next was really necessary. So thank you, my friend. I'm so happy to have you back here on Straight Outta Flushing and to talk more about it. I want everybody, please check out Wardy's YouTube channel. Does a fantastic job with Mets content throughout the season. This man goes at it every day. He's doing lives. He's doing previews. He's doing everything. Check him out. He's seriously one of the best when it comes to Mets content creation. Wardy, I appreciate you, man. Thanks for coming through on Straight Outta Flushing.
Dexter, thank you so much for the kind words. It's always a pleasure to chop it up with you, and I really enjoyed this discussion. Listen, the Mets season's come to a close. We can now get ourselves set for what's going to be a lengthy off season, but hopefully we find ourselves in an eventful discussion next time we're breaking it down here at Straight Outta Flushing.
I hope so, man. Next time we talk, it should be a good one. Thank you. Appreciate you, man.